Good morning, everyone. Today's reading is from Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 40, and you can find it on page 70 of your Pew Bible. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Blessed be the word of the Lord.
About a week ago, Nanette Smith gave me a book to read. And a lot of people give me books, and I put them down, and I'll get to them sooner or later. But I decided, because of the subject matter, I wanted to start this book right away, and it became a book I couldn't put down. So I'm sitting in my office just reading a book for like 2 days. And, but I knew I was going to use it in the sermon, so. I want to show you a picture of the cover of that book. The name of the book is The Allure of Immortality. The thing that drew me in and why I had to start reading it is because it's the story of the Koreshan cult, which is located at the state park at the end of Corkscrew on 41. And my wife and I and my friend from New Mexico, Steve Wired, we went there in the middle of a hot summer day and walked throughout the entire thing. And Steve was complaining about the heat, but we made him continue in the journey. But I want you to show you some of the pictures we took while we were at that site of the cult. There's the main house where they worshiped, where they did, this is a very artistic cult. They did music, they did all kinds of art, and they had an orchestra, and it's inside that hall where they would worship, but they'd also have concerts, and the whole community was allowed to come. This wasn't a kind of a cult where they just holed up and they didn't relate to anybody. They let the community come, and there was some sense of community service in allowing people to come to their concerts. Next picture. That's a picture of the big dormitory building that was built. That was for the women, and so that's where there was other buildings around, but that was one of the main ones, and it's very distinct, stands right out on the campus. This is a large, sprawling campus, by the way. Let's see the next picture. That's a picture right outside that building you just saw of the leadership group. You know, we Presbyterians call our elected leaders the session or the deacons. They call themselves the planetary court, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And then that's our friend Steve Wired. Some of you know him, and that's just to show that cult-like people still are wandering around the place, and you got to look out for them. Anyway, the cult was begun by a man by the name of Cyrus Teed, and he used the Old Testament Hebrew pronunciation of the name Cyrus, so that's where the word Koresh comes from, and so it was called the Koreshan cult. And they came from Chicago. It was in the late 19th century, which was in some ways, if you understand the history of the country at that time on a religious philosophical perspective, it was a time in our history of raging fundamentalism, but at the same time, it was a history of the development of cults that in a way rejected the fundamentalism but kind of went in some weird ways. And you had very well-known cults like the Shakers, Christian Science, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Economites, and the largest American cult that ever happened, the Mormon Church. Cyrus Teed, started out life as an alternative medicine physician, which was kind of looked upon by many people as being kind of weird science. There were some things in his medical science and practice that became part of regular medical science, but there's also some pretty strange ideas. But he started out in that way, alternative doctor, physician. But there was more to him than that. He had some pretty strange beliefs. One of his beliefs was that the earth, the world was hollow, and we lived on a sphere inside the earth. So when you look up at the sky, you're not seeing the sky, you're seeing the inside of the outermost sphere. Because everything outside planet Earth, there was nothing. It was just nothingness. So he believed that and taught it, and even tried to get people who knew physics to prove it. In fact, they did a measuring experiment on Naples Beach once to try to prove his theory. He also believed that he was basically the new Messiah, and that because of their beliefs, he would eventually get run down by mobs and killed by the mobs. But then, after being killed, he would theocratize, which is a word he made up, and it basically means resurrection in his own version. So theocratize was his version of resurrection. And his cult that he started, which was mostly made up of women, and men were howling up north because he stole their wives from them, started out as a celibate cult, which he had a little trouble abiding by himself. But it was a social justice kind of a thing in the minds of the women who joined, because these were women who were kind of radical, and they believed that celibacy was the way that they got freed from slavery to men. The book is fascinating. It drew me in. I couldn't stop reading it. And it's fascinating just not because of that information about the cult, but because it does a really good job of giving us local history in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in Lee County. And there's history about Fort Myers in it. It's good stuff. And this book was just written in 2015 by a professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. And the book is written in the context of what was then, in that time of history, a very strange religious landscape in the United States. And the level of devotion by the people who followed this Cyrus Teed, this man who called himself Koresh, was pretty intense. And it was so intense that he didn't die the way he predicted, but that didn't matter. He basically died as a result 2 years later of a fist fight with the editor of the Fort Myers Press newspaper 2 years before. And then things kind of went south from there, and 2 years later he died. And his followers were so intense and believed that he was going to theocratize, resurrect very soon. They laid his dead body in a zinc bathtub, which had some special meaning, and they sat around the bathtub and they waited for days. They wouldn't leave the side for days, waiting for him to theocratize, which he didn't. He decomposed. But every stage of decomposition, they saw signs in that. That's how intense they were in their belief, until the health director from Lee County came in and made them bury the guy. Now, I share this because, in a very real way, it's reflective of what human beings do and have done throughout the march of history. There are always people disenchanted with society and the world that they live in, with the things the way they are, who are looking to buy in to a different idea. And because those people have always existed, there are always the charismatic self-promoters who like to take advantage of that. Teed took advantage of a culture where science was just beginning to make advancements, but there was a lot of suspicion as well. Now, what happened is, among the fundamentalists, as science was beginning to make advancements in that time in history, they rejected science altogether and clung mightily to the biblical stories of how the earth came into being and everything else. There were others, however, who tried to approach it by bringing in science and faith, matters of faith together, and trying to make sense out of them in working together with each other. Cyrus Teed was on this side of the equation. So he had some scientific background, but then he kind of brought in these weird spiritual ideas, and he tried to unite the two, and he created this movement of wacky ideas, and people fell for it, and he was charismatic, so they followed him. So he didn't toss science out, but he made science accommodate to his belief system in some funny ways. And, you know, all we can say is, thank God we don't do that anymore, huh? There's a museum in Kentucky that tells you that the earth is only 6,000 years old and that dinosaurs and the first human beings lived with each other. And that's irregardless of the fact that science has already told us that the gap between humans and dinosaurs, at least non-avian dinosaurs, is 65 million years. And although in our society today, even now, there seems to be some kind of raging conflict between science and faith, the fact of the matter is that studies show that's really not true. A recent Pew Research poll tells us that 68% of adults in America say that science does not conflict with their religious beliefs. There are 250 million adults in our country today. So that means 68% of them say science and religion don't conflict. But that leaves 77 million people who say they do and who reject science in some way. That indicates that there's a vocal minority out there, but the minority is still rather big, and they make a lot of noise. Now, being willfully uninformed is the magic potion for being sucked in to narrow thinking or cult-like thinking. So, do you want to believe that you can become a god like Jesus? There's a modern cult for you to join. It's called the Mormon Church. Do you want to believe that Jesus never was actually true flesh and blood, but for all the years of his life on earth was a ghost? There's a cult for you. It's called Jehovah's Witnesses. Do you believe that the mothership will come back and take you to your rightful planet? There was a cult for you. They all committed suicide in 1997, called Heaven's Gate. And there's many more than that. I can go on and on and on. And the reality is, Christian faith and society does not corner the market on cult thinking and behavior. It is evident and real in every major religion in the world. But remember this, regardless of where you find it, such thinking arises out of the phenomenon of willingly wanting to be uninformed. Today's passage read to you has often been misused and has given rise to cults that preach and teach that believers need to just sit and wait for the coming of Jesus and do nothing. And that those don't pay attention to the activity going around in the world. You're not of the world. Don't worry about it. Jesus is going to come back. He's going to take you up, and you have nothing more to worry about. Clearly, when you take the passage read today like that, it pulls the teachings of Jesus Christ completely out of the context to which they were meant to speak and be meaningful. Now, there is a debate among scholars as to whether or not that particular passage was actually the words of Christ or the words of the church decades after Christ. We won't get into that today. But assuming that these are the words of Christ, they still are not a crisis for people who hold a responsible faith in God. Nowhere in this passage, and nowhere in passages like it in the Gospels, do we read that we as Christians, as the followers of Christ, are supposed to sit around, do nothing, and just wait. There's nothing in the Gospel that tells us that that's the position we should be taking. In fact, Christ is quite clear through both word and example how we are about to be the business of discipleship. And this passage points out it can be challenging to all of us. The most uncomfortable part of this passage today for us is when Jesus tells his followers this one thing: sell your possessions and serve God with those proceeds. How many of us are doing that? Somehow Jesus says it, but somehow we can't get there from here. So that's one difficult part I think that we all have to take ownership in. What does Jesus mean exactly by that? And we all answer it our own way. It's kind of the conscience of our faith to determine how God wants us to live, and we Presbyterians allow for that kind of room and space to exist. So the first part of that passage tells us to do something that conflicts with the very way that every one of us live in this world. But then the passage goes on to say, Jesus speaking, be dressed for action, Jesus says. Have your lamps lit. And then Jesus says, blessed are those whom the master will find alert when he comes. I don't see anything in there that says, sit on your duff and wait. I hear words that say, yeah, I am coming into your lives once and for all for eternal purposes. But right now, your life, your calling, is all about action, always about action, always about discipleship. It's always about serving the kingdom of God while we live here for as long as we live here. Cyrus Teed instructed his people down in Estero to sit around his zinc bathtub and wait for his version of the resurrection to come when he died. And as I said, they watched him decompose. But according to Christ and his teaching, God's plan for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter how old we are, how young we are, God's plan is that there is no idle waiting for something out of the ordinary to happen, except for what we make happen as empowered by the Spirit of the living God in our world. Resurrection happened as followers were attempting to get on with their lives. The women came to the tomb to do their duty and get Jesus buried. And the disciples waited and were trying to figure out what they were going to do next with what Jesus taught them. And resurrection happened in the midst of their confusion about what their world was at that moment. And that makes resurrection relevant to us in any time and place, because the resurrection of Jesus Christ breaks into our confusion about who we are and what we're supposed to do. And Christ calls us, as he does in this passage, to be alert, to be ready to keep our lamps lit, and do Christ's bidding for as long as we live. That sounds like the gospel that we really need. And it's not about running off to a swamp and a stero and hiding until somebody comes back to save us. For we are a people attempting to get on with our lives. And in any era, we are mostly confused about what happens in the world. But God's highest values are the ones that we know well, we talk about all the time, and are the ones to guide us into our lives. Justice, peace, reconciliation, servanthood to the least of our brothers and sisters. And that just doesn't happen by sitting and waiting. It happens by having our lamps lit. And when they are, Christ will arrive, and we will see him every time. Amen. Let us stand and